I've been around medicine a long time. So I started in the laboratory end of things in 1976, actually. So it's been doing this a while. Went back, finished medical schools a long time ago. And what happened, really, just the very short version of the story is, when I started practice, I really wanted to be a general practitioner, which is what I was. But I was also very interested in a lot of integrative medicine topics and palliative care things. So what started to happen almost right away when I opened was people realized that I was doing certain types of therapies that other doctors in the neighborhood weren't. And so we started to get a lot of cancer patients. So it didn't start out that I thought cancer would be the focus, et cetera, but that's really very rapidly what happened. Very sick people with the chronic illness and cancer. And that really grew into, if you go back, say, 25 years or more, the idea of palliative oncology was almost non-existent. The idea of integrative oncology was almost non-existent. I mean, it was really we were all learning a lot, but people needed help. So that's really where it started. And from there, there was a good part of 20 years where I did that a lot. I also, I've always taught. I teach physicians as a large part of what I do now, and mentored doctors. And so I was really involved in trying to, move that part of medicine forward. And in and amongst all of that, in about 2000, uh, let's just, for sake of argument, say 8 or 9. You mentioned NIH. I had a university post where I was a full-time professor in a medical school, and we had a NIH funded study we were doing. And it was a collaborative between my university and the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, which is University of Washington and Children's Hospital and Fred Hutchinson and, some very big players. And what it started was, I didn't start with the study, but I joined it right away. And it was, if we took people who had largely breast cancer, but there were a lot of other cancers as well, from this large collaborative, those who wanted to do integrative therapies and palliative therapies, this stuff I've been doing, what if we track them and then match them to people same age who did standard therapies? And so everyone did standard therapies, but we had to do add-ons. After 5 years, would we see better quality of life or survival, et cetera? And so we did that for 5 years. What got me involved was the study had an interventional part that they couldn't start until they had somebody who had done that before, and that's what I was doing, the intravenous therapies and all of these other interventional things. So I was part of that for the 5 years, and I almost thought we got funded because they didn't think it would make a difference. And at the end, we
Mm.
actually got some very positive note that our patients did actually live longer, compared to age matched. And it spawned another study that looks a lot at quality of life and some other things that are going on. So I've had not planning it at all, but I've had a very rich background with cancer patients. And so what really happened as far as writing about cancer, I've always written because I'm a teacher, but right after the study, I started to publicize some of the things that we had done. Because if you've ever looked at studies, there may be parts of the studies that no one ever publishes because there's so many things you discover you didn't realize. So I went and started teaching. Well, I was doing that, and a doctor I hadn't seen in 25 years, who went to medical school together, came up to me at a conference and said, "You should really tell this story." And you, he says, "You'll have a hard time getting a publishing deal, though, because no one knows you except in the academic world." And he says, "But I can get you a publishing deal." So we wrote a book together that predates this book, which was really a lot about those other things, sort of the, what I would call what happens to you with cancer, and what are choices to make that are better and worse in the, integrative space, et cetera. When we were done with that, that book's in many languages around the world. It's been very popular. It's called Outside the Box Cancer Therapies. But when we were done, I was mentoring my clinic and my doctors. And one of the things that I felt like we did a great job with what do you do with cancer as far as your body goes. But what I kept running into was, we talked a little about the mind-body connection and just the logistics of, oh, what do I do with this diagnosis? I didn't want it. What do I do with my family? What do I do with, everything? So the more I worked on that with my own doctors and mentored people, the more I thought, agnostic of how you're treating cancer, what you're doing about your cancer, the internal part that you go through and your closest loved ones go through and you get diagnosed is so critically important. So that led to this book, Cancer: The Journey from Diagnosis to Empowerment. Literally, the point. It's I designed it to be easy to read, not super heavy and academic, which the first time I ever wrote something like that. But honestly, there's some research and some data and things that I, looked at or whatever, but really this came from just my day-to-day experience over those 3 decades, and looking people in the eye, getting diagnosis and walking them through that. So the point really is, there is a way to go from the shock and whatever emotions go on that you feel to a place where you're more, empowered, self-actualized, whatever you want to call that. But it doesn't happen automatically for most people.
I feel like anecdotally, we speak about that a lot in our like support groups and our blogs and the work that we do, because we know that anecdotally, it makes us feel better, right? When we exercise, we feel better. When we take time to focus on the breath and the mind-body connection that you're talking about, we know it helps, but we don't always know why it helps. And I would like to take a step back quickly too, just so we can define terms for people who might not be aware when we talk about kind of like the traditional therapies. I think you're referring to like the surgery, the radiation, and the chemotherapy, whereas integrative care, which I think is a nice segue from what used to be referred to as alternative medicine, where it's no longer alternative. It's how can we put these therapies together and really integrate them so that the quality of life is there for the person going through the treatment.
It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the goal. Yeah,
Exactly.
Exactly.
And I know when I was going through my own personal treatment too, a lot of these integrative therapies were recommended to me, such as acupuncture, to help with some of the side effects that I was going through. And, it's I think just a mindset also. So what I love about your book is that right from the beginning, you kind of paint this picture of the shock and the devastation that comes with a cancer diagnosis, and then how mentally we can start making this shift. And you kind of talk about two different characters in your book and kind of the diversion that these two characters take. Can you tell me a little bit about these personas?
Yeah, so there's two characters that you get to meet. Well, you get to meet some other people later, but Bob and Gia, and they're actually real people. Obviously, it's not their names, and I changed details so no one knows who they are, but they're very real people. And that was a big part of the motivation to write the book, other than what I was seeing just with patients, and there was sort of a hole here in that space. But the publishers I came up with the idea of, could I tell two stories? And the publisher really encouraged that, because the rest of the book is useful from a technical point of view of, gee, I'm stuck and I'm angry. Where do I go? Or I can't get my family on board, or whatever it is. The stories really are there to give the two counterpoints to ways you deal with that trip from being diagnosed to either not being empowered or being empowered. So each one of them embodies that, and it's real stories. It's everything in the book is very, very real, from real experience. So the point of that, though, is it, sometimes we learn from data and bulleted points, and there's that, and sometimes you just learn from stories. Stories are wonderful. And the first thing I always like to say is, I don't judge either point of view. Of course, you never want a patient to become angry and stuck and self-sabotage, but one of them did. So it didn't make me happy that they did, but that's the person's choice. Everything's your choice. But if you want to do something other than that, there is a trajectory. So those two stories really are, we see a lot of ourselves in them in different places. And the stories, each chapter sort of has the technical parts of where to go. the story kind of unfolds in that, in that order and direction. So yeah, it's there to add some humanity to, what otherwise could be a little
Yes.
technical book.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we forget that our own diagnosis extends just beyond the self, that it impacts our families, our friends. And I use the term like we all the time, like we have cancer, we are going through cancer, we are going through treatment. Because as I think you point out in the book, is there's this grieving process that we're all on a different journey in terms of those like anger phase, denial phase, acceptance phase, etc. But then our family and loved ones might be on a different path also. And so how do we deal with these different personalities? Or, in my experience, I love my mom to death. She's a nurse. And when I was going through breast cancer, she wanted to be the nurse. And I really had to turn to her and say, no, I need you to be my mom right now.
Yeah.
And that was a challenging and hard conversation to have. But, I think you talk about that also in your book in terms of the role the family plays and the grieving process too.
Yeah, I think, and we've all seen it from both points of view. Sometimes it's the patient with cancer who is the one really struggling and maybe stuck in, denial or whatever stage of grief. And I did use those stages of grief, it's a framework we're all familiar with usually, and it is actually the order that people kind of process cancer diagnosis in too. But the other side of it, though, is you can actually be doing pretty good as the patient, but you have to understand, and it's not your responsibility, but the people around you who love you and are close to you are just as shocked and just don't know what to do. And they might be angry, or they might, what happens a lot, like with your mother as a nurse or any medical person, their default is, if I do something for you medically as a nurse, or if I'm your doctor, I'm doing something to help you. And really, it's harder sometimes to take that role off and just to
Mm,
be the loved one, the parent, the spouse, the partner, whatever. And that's really, we talk about that in the book, those discussions of, look, it's great you want to do that, but this is what I need from you. I need this
yes.
primary relationship we have. And it's so important. And a lot of times, and I saw this, weekly with patient families, some it's just like it works out and everyone sort of sorts out where they're at and they get over, the place they were stuck. But sometimes you really have these two divergent things, especially with like partners, spouses, and that's not a healthy, like, the point of the book is, if we move more towards being empowered in our small circle, including the patient, our outcomes are better. It's not great to have cancer, but it's a more doable thing, and you actually get better outcomes when you do have that. So your close circle is so huge, um, and they're going through it a different way. What I usually remind people is, when you hear that you have cancer, it activates your fight or flight system, and it activates your partner's fight or flight system. But what that connects to is two different worlds. They may have seen some very bad outcome with cancer, or had a primary loved one or relative go through something that they thought, I never ever want to see that in my life. Well, then you hear, well, my wife has cancer. It takes them there. It doesn't take them to some logical place. So there's a lot to, it's not easy, but it's really worth it. And it's really worth it, at least to get the people closest to you on board.
Absolutely. And I think you were hitting on some key points about, empowerment. How can the patient feel empowered to have those conversations with people to say, this is what serves me now, this is what's helpful to me and what's not helpful to me. I think a lot of times, it's easy to just kind of harbor some of those emotions and not really make sense of it, and to feel that it's okay to disagree with someone if it doesn't help you. What I love about your book is that you immediately say, like, it's okay to be selfish. Now is the time to put yourself first, and yourself and your health are the only things that matter. Everything else is secondary. And I think just reading that was like yes, like I'm ready to go take on the world. Like I matter, I'm important, and I can say
Yeah.
like yes to what I need. And whether that's a nap or whether that's a walk, I sometimes feel like having those words and reading them give us the permission to say that it's okay. You're allowing us that permission to be okay on those
Yeah.
good days and to not be okay on those bad days.
It's, as you well know, it's most people are not socialized to a place where it's okay to, be the center of what needs to happen, and that becomes a real, stumbling block for a lot of people, which is why, almost every, if not every chapter where there's sort of, you can get stuck here and move on, the first thing I say is it's okay to be that way. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to whatever. The point is that's a place in time and you want to move from there. But the other thing is it's more than okay for you to take care of yourself and say whatever it is, I can't do this activity anymore. I need to focus on this, or I need time so I can take care of my body, or whatever it is.
Yes.
And most people just don't have that internal, the message they hear back is, well, you should think about other people, or something like that. Um, and we should not think about other people, but you are engaged with a process that's not got your best interests at heart, so you have to have your best interests at heart.
And you
Yeah.
definitely make that connection between like the emotional piece, those thoughts we tell ourselves in our head, and the impact that it has on our outcome and diagnosis. A lot of the conversations that I have in some of my circles most recently, I am 4 years out from my original diagnosis, and I am still healing. I am still now trying to let go of the pre-cancer me, work on the current version of me, and also trying to be gentle and practice that self-care piece, because there's still a lot of things that I can't do. And just last night in one of our support groups that we hold every Thursday night, we were talking about like we can't ever go back, just like the grieving process, right? Like we can't be in that hole of, oh, I wish I could have done, should have done, used to be able to do. But look at all the amazing things now that I can do because I've come out on this other side, whether it's, I no longer practice the vigorous yoga I used to do. It's more of like a slow meditative practice, and coming to terms with that. I would love to hear your opinion on kind of like the self-care and the self-healing piece, and what you say to someone who's still maybe a little bit stuck in that like sad world of like, how did this happen to me, but I want to come out of it. How can I take better care of myself?
The first thing, that I think is most important with that discussion is allowing the person time to get to that place where they actually say it. Because
Mm-hmm.
if some outside person just tells you, look, you need to stop thinking about the past and you need to do some self-care or whatever, sometimes people need that maybe to move off the dime, but really that has to come from within. And I think the most important thing is it's not it's the extremely rare human who wakes up one morning and says, okay, today I'm all about self-care and I'm going to forget about the pre-cancer me. Most people, it's just, I've come to a realization, I want to go there, I have no idea how to do it. So I'm willing, but I'm, unaware. That's the moment at which then, whoever is helping, whether it's a medical person or family or a therapist or whatever, or support group, that's the point at which you provide resources that are the next steps. And I think the most important thing is not overwhelming people, because you can come to realization, for people who don't have cancer, it's sometimes they'll come to realization, "Oh, I need to take better care of myself and exercise." Well, if you suddenly give them, a 400-point exercise plan and they've never exercised it, they're not, that's overwhelming. Same if you have cancer and you realize you got to do something, you have to move away, from past thinking, etc. You got to start with just baby steps and move forward. So a lot of it is that holding a place for the fact that you're new at this, realizing you can only do so much at a time, and really you probably saw kind of the order the book is written in. What I say is that you might be great with the stuff in chapter 1, but chapter 2 you might be stuck at. Great, spend some time there. It's baby steps, and every day, just like grieving or just like processing anything, every day is a new day to do that too. So you don't necessarily wake up on day 2 or day 20 and say, I've got all that handled. And, most of the time you wake up and say, I still have cancer and I need to, I need to be in this other place with it. So a lot of it is just being gentle, gentle motivation forward tools when they're needed, but not too many. Because I did see that a lot. That sort of stimulated some memories for me about when I was thinking of writing the book. Mentoring doctors, especially newer ones, and they would get a cancer patient and give them way too much all at once, and the
Mm,
patient's just like overwhelmed with so they have all this physical stuff they're doing, and maybe they're doing chemo, or maybe they're getting surgery and recovering and doing 11 other things, and then they've got a 40-point list about changing their diet and their mental set and their other. It's like, without cancer you can't do all that with so
exactly.
let's start with one thing and move you forward and keep going. And I think that's the most humane way, but it's also the most sustainable way to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hear a lot of times that, cancer could be that catalyst that wakes us up and that ignites some sort of flame
Mhm.
within us to make behavioral changes. And another piece that I love about your book too, as you give us all of these tools and allow us to linger in various chapters as we're doing the inner work to heal internally. I think that's incredibly important what you mentioned. And I think one of the tools that you share in the book is the opportunity for us to control what is in our control and then let go of what is not in our control. I think so much of a cancer diagnosis, when you feel like everything is ripped out of you, how can we make sense of what we can do on like kind of these small chunks of bite-sized chunks of like day to day, this is something that's in my control. And it could be that mindset, or it could be the diet, it could be taking a walk or an exercise, like something that is tangible, because so much of it is unknown, especially in the cancer world.
Yeah, and it is so critically important with cancer as a journey, but especially like with what you're describing, where treatments can change suddenly, surgeries can, everything can change suddenly because your body is going to react the way your body reacts. And we see that all the time. You get 10 people with the same chemo regimen, and 7 do one way and 3 do 3 different ways. And so, yeah, part of what I try to get to in the book is those are things that you don't want to totally like just go on autopilot and say, well, whatever, but I mean, you only have so much control over how your surgery goes. That's, you can prepare for it, you can do all this stuff, but the rest is about the surgeon, your body, and how it all works together. Same with chemo, or a targeted therapy or something. Your body and your immune system do the work, and you may not have total control. And one of the things I've seen that gets people to stay stuck is if their focus is all on, especially people that like a lot of control. That's a human condition, but some people are much more into control than other people.
Absolutely.
Um, I've seen them get so tied up in those things that they can't really control, that there's no energy for the stuff you can, which are the harder things, literally waking up and saying, it's another day with cancer, but it's my day. It's,
Mhm.
this is going to, whatever happens, however I feel, it's still my day, and this is going to be how it goes. And I think that switch of do an inventory, because, every month it's different.
Mhm.
What's in your control? What's kind of in your control? Like, you could maybe choose your doctor, maybe choose whatever, but beyond that, the medical side, like you say, it's going to do what it's going to do. So then you got a whole bunch of other stuff you're in control of, and that is empowering in of itself, because if people get to stay stuck in the area of stuff they can't control, you're automatically disqualified. You're disempowered, because I can't be empowered about something I have no control over.
I think it's also hard too, going back to the chapters on like family and friends. They turn to you to say, like, well, what's next? What's happening next? They want a roadmap also. And so all of a sudden it can be compounded with, I was given some information, the information changed. And now as I'm talking to the newly diagnosed, it's very similar type of peer-to-peer advice of, you have to be flexible and nimble and just kind of go with the flow sometimes, because it'll save you some stress and heartache on the
Yeah,
other end.
and people, obviously, we don't, if we don't have cancer, we're not usually sitting around focusing on how cancer is treated and things. But I always try to tell people, look, your radiation oncologist or your medical oncologist or surgical oncologist, they have huge jobs that have almost no margin for error. And so their whole world is tied up in dosing your radiation or figuring out your chemo or changing your chemo or doing the right surgery for the moment, um, to keep you as safe and healthy as possible. So like, that's their world. They're really tied up in it. And you just don't know how many variables they have to sift through. So changes are part of the deal usually. So pick good doctors, let them do their work, keep on top of what they're doing, ask questions, but then, focus on being as prepared as possible to either do or not do treatment, or be as prepared as possible to deal with what you can. It's a huge thing. If you think, oh, because I'll use this analogy. Most of us have been to the doctor because we got, strep throat or we had a broken leg. Those are pretty linear treatments. There's X amount of time, there's this medicine, and you're better sometime in the future. Cancer doesn't work that way. You know, every day there's sort of all these variables that get thrown up in the air, and then, you see which balls hit the floor first, and that's what you do. Um, Very different. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's really good peer-to-peer advice.
I want to pick your
Yeah.
brain up a little bit more on the mindfulness and kind of taking a deeper dive into the integrative therapies and complementary care that you were discussing in your book. And I know you also mentioned a little bit about palliative care. I think sometimes we think about palliative care as like end of life and sometimes use it interchangeably with hospice, but it's not
Mm,
necessarily. And to utilize the palliative care and integrative cares as quality of life,
mm.
how can we speak about a quality of life and how do you define that?
I think that's a really good, and sometimes I forget because I think of palliative care as really encompassing, but a lot of people do. They hear palliative and they think, oh no, it's the same as hospice or something.
Right.
Now it can include that, but really, as I was mentioning earlier, 20, 30 years ago, the idea of palliative oncology was just end of life care. It has come a very long way since then. So now what that really means, and maybe a better term, although it's not the term people normally use, is quality of life and health enhancement is really what you're talking about in modern times. Now, going back to just what I said earlier about, you've got your surgical oncologist and medical and radiation oncologist, their world is wrapped up in their treatments, which are so complex. They understand the need for this other stuff, but that's not their job. That's not what they do. It's people like me who do the quality of life and other care. What I usually tell people is, there's really four steps in a cancer journey. The first step is you don't know you have cancer, and it's primary prevention. Most people are always making cancer cells, but they don't develop cancer or don't do till later. The next step is what the book is talking about, which is diagnosis and initial treatment. And then the next step is actually recovery from treatment, so that you stay in remission or you get towards remission, et cetera. And then the next step is secondary prevention, which is let's not have it come back or get worse or whatever. And the reason I divide it that way for people's minds is the amount of effort and energy you as a patient have, time-wise, energy-wise, et cetera, to put into working on those things is very different at each step. Primary prevention, preventing things, that can be 100%. If you are just starting with some surgery and chemo or radiation or whatever, you aren't going to have time and energy for very much. You're going to do, maybe, like I say, baby steps just to shore up everything. But in the recovery part, in what I would call palliative or quality of life recovery care, it's not about hospice or end of life normally. It's about, let's get you recovered from all of all of this treatment you just had. It's
Yes.
there's no maybe there is. I can't think of a cancer therapy of any kind that is any fun, and you come out the other side feeling healthier than you did when you started.
Totally.
It's there's this job you're doing of treating cancer, and now you want to recover. Well, one of the things, and I get to the mental emotional part in this book. The prior book, we talked a lot about it medically, but the more you do on the other end of recovery from surgery, radiation, chemo, et cetera, actually the more calm your cancer stem cells are and the less chance of recurrence later on. So when we're talking about palliative oncology, yeah, it's the whole spectrum. And while it might include more end of life things, that's 5% of what we're trying to do. Mostly what we're trying to do is make you as healthy as possible so that you have the lowest index of cancer wanting to come back or be aggressive, etc. If your brain is stuck in that place where you're still angry, you don't want this cancer, you're mad at it, you're a victim, um, your body doesn't heal the same. And so it's part and parcel with the external things you do, such as fixing your body after surgery, or recovering from chemo or whatever. It's also your brain being on board with that, so it moves you forward.
And I do kind of want to reframe this also because I'm also very sensitive to a lot of women in our community who were diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer de novo. And so there is some anger there where you don't have that initial early stage to
Yeah.
have that option. You think you're being preventative, and there's a variety of reasons why that happens. But, when we and I don't want to put words in your mouth or like for your book, but as I was reading about the secondary prevention piece, it wasn't just a second recurrence of breast cancer, but it was that no evidence of disease or no progression of disease, right? Like, how can we take this and again, still feel empowered and even with a terminal diagnosis, still move forward and again, be empowered with the choices and the control that we have every single day that we wake up.
Mhm. So secondary prevention, the nice thing about the more modern way of looking at it is it's not just for people with no evidence of disease or in true remission. It's also for people who are either really, we had two other areas. One was uh, progressive but slow progressive disease, and the other was stable disease. And so you may have metastatic, stage 4 cancer, but you can do everything you can to keep it either very slow progressive or stable. So it's not in remission, but it's remission-like. Um, and it's the same steps. It's just you're going to deal with different emotions because you literally had a whole bunch of options you never got. Uh,
Yeah.
Important part is it's still so critical to do the mental, emotional, and mind-body connection work, et cetera, to get beyond that. Because we've literally had people um, with metastatic disease who, you know, through whatever combination of therapies and supportive things, stayed stable and had very good quality of life for years and years and years. And yeah, they never, stage 4 cancer didn't go away. You don't really see that very much, but they had, what they said were wonderful life. In the NIH research, the large majority of people that were doing interventional things that I was in charge of, all but one were stage 4 people, most stage 4 at
Wow.
diagnosis, and they were, which makes you more amenable in research to do all sorts of things, which is what we did. But they had all mostly come to the place where they were an empowered group, and they didn't like having stage 4 cancer, and they didn't like the effects and all of that. But the reason they were part of this research project and were in my section were they knew that at some point it would help somebody down the road.
100%. That gives me goosebumps. I totally
Yeah,
agree.
those are the people that motivate me. Many of them are no longer with us, but a lot of them still are. You know, we
Hmm.
we had one lady that was diagnosed at 85. Doctor said she wouldn't live to see 86, and we celebrated her 90th birthday in our office, and she made it to 96 years. She lived 10 years,
Yeah,
and it
that's
was all
amazing.
her, like, just the way she dealt with it. So yeah, it's not, none of the things are easy. Um, these aren't easy conversations to have with yourself, let alone with, people in your
Yeah.
circle, but they're so necessary for your mind to be free to let you be as healed as you can be.
Well, Dr. Anderson, I think this has been a great, amazing conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours more about your book. But I think we do need to leave something for our listeners to want to go out and get your book so they can read some of the things that we haven't yet talked about. Is there anything that I haven't covered or asked about the various chapters, the writing process, or some of the healing processes that you want to share with us that I haven't maybe asked directly?
The one part, which is your audience, it's a little different for, but it's certainly, unfortunately, a growing part of cancer work. There's very specifically two things in the book that I added because of our experience. One is families with cancer, so pediatric cancer. A very unfortunate thing in modern life is there are more and more pediatric cancers, and there's a zillion reasons, but there are. That adds 10 layers of complexity to the family dynamics, because depending on what age the child is when they're diagnosed, the family really has to go through all this and do that. um, we we did a lot of work, and now I mentor doctors who do a lot of work with childhood cancers.
Mm.
So there's a whole section just about that. And then in the other kind of, so that's a sort of a unique chapter. The other unique chapter is I had two people. One was a cancer patient. The other was a adult son of a father who went through a cancer diagnosis, and then two families with children who were diagnosed with cancer do interviews. And thankfully they're such giving people. I asked them all the same questions, and so there's a chapter with what would they prefer you not say to them when they're
Yes.
diagnosed. What's a better way to help me when you find out I have cancer? Or in the case of one of them, my father is dealing with a terminal cancer process. I'm taking care of him. How can you help us the best? And what do we really not need to hear from you? And it's just really great things. Or my child has cancer. How I don't know, even know how to talk to you. What's the best ways to go with that or not? Or how do you help me?
Mhm.
So those two chapters they're a little bit unique. They fit in obviously because it's the whole process, but those are the whole book's very personal, but those are super personal because there's real faces and processes to those. So in addition to all of the work for us adults, there's those other things which were great.
Right now, obviously, we aren't working with adolescents or children with cancer, but we are in our community do have a population of moms who have various genetic mutations, and we are trying to figure out how to navigate those tough conversations with our daughters. And at what point do you let your daughter know if they can't get genetic testing until they're 18 years old? What, like, as moms, like, we're harboring kind of this heavy weight on our shoulders, and we want to do everything we want to do it for our children and our families, and then at some point having some of these tough conversations as well. So I think, rightly so, talking about just breast cancer in my case, but like cancer in terms of your book, and then how we started off the conversation, right? It's a we, it's not an I, it's not an individual patient. It really impacts all sorts of dynamics of the family and friend life. So I really appreciate you just kind of sharing and giving us tactical, like, things we can do to be better, and the positive empowerment that we can all embrace as we make this journey a little bit less painful.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.